Hi there, everybody. My name is Justin, and it's great to be with you at Aletheia Online today. We are continuing in our teaching series, Road to Resurrection. And what we're doing in this series is we're looking up to the lead up to Easter in the Gospel of Luke. And we're seeking to understand not just the events that we commemorate on Easter, but what they mean. And here's how the Gospel of Luke helps us do that. In the lead up, Luke slows the narrative way down, almost like a slow motion camera shot of the narrative. And he gives us these very poignant moments where Jesus and the disciples are interacting and are facing similar situations. And he tells their stories kind of in parallel, side by side, about how Jesus responds to the situation and how the disciples respond. And this contrast and the interaction between these two parallel stories gives us deeper insight into the meaning of Easter. So we're going to be continuing on in Luke chapter 22. Luke 22, and we're going to begin in verse 31. Now, while you're turning there in a Bible or in a Bible app, let me kind of remind you of where we finished off last week. We looked at the Passover meal that Jesus has with his disciples. And it's a bit of a tense meal. Jesus announces that he's inaugurating or cutting, if you will, the new covenant, this new way to relate to God through faith in him. But the dinner is also tense. He says that there's a betrayer at the table. And then the disciples start comparing each other and which of them is going to be greatest, and Jesus has to correct them. And now we're going to kind of look at the final scene in that Passover meal and what follows. And Jesus turns his attention to Simon, whose name is Peter. Simon and Peter are the same person. And then to the disciples as a whole. So we're going to begin in verse 31 of Luke chapter 22. And we're going to read through verse 53. So Luke 22, verse 31 through 53. Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you, that he might sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. Peter said to him, Lord, I am ready to go with you both to prison and to death. Jesus said, I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow this day until you deny me 3 times. Until you deny 3 times that you know me. And he said to them, when I sent you out with no money bag or knapsack or sandals, did you lack anything? They said, nothing. He said to them, but now let the one who has a money bag take it, and likewise a knapsack. And let the one who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. For I tell you that this scripture must be fulfilled in me. And he was numbered with the transgressors. For what is written about me has its fulfillment. And they said, look, Lord, here are 2 swords. And he said to them, it is enough. And he came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. And when he came to the place, he said to them, pray, that you may not enter into temptation. And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and knelt down and prayed, saying, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. And when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping for sorrow. And he said to them, why are you sleeping? Rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation. While he was still speaking, there came a crowd, and the man called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He drew near to Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus said to him, Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? And when those who were around him saw what would follow, they said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, no more of this. And he touched his ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and the officers of the temple and elders who had come out against him, have you come out against a robber? Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me. But this is your hour and the power of darkness. This is the word of the Lord. Let's pray and ask that He would guide us in it. Heavenly Father, we pray that you would deepen our understanding of the meaning of this time in the year where we celebrate the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Lord, we want to know what it means. We want to know what it means for our lives, and we want to see it with new clarity and significance. So would you help and guide us by your Spirit? In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. So here's something that's true for everybody. Trouble brings stuff out of you. Trouble brings stuff out of you. It's kind of like a toothpaste tube that when it's squeezed, whatever's inside comes out. And that's precisely what happens here in this encounter. Jesus and the disciples face trouble the likes of which they haven't yet faced. And when Jesus is facing this trouble, what comes out of him is a deep and profound faith in God. And when the disciples face the trouble and they're squeezed, what comes out of them is not faith in God, but rather they turn to an alternative. Now, what comes out of us, among other things, when we face trouble is it exposes what we trust. And let's be clear about something. It's not the case that religious people have faith and secular people don't have faith. Everybody trusts something. Everybody trusts something. And trouble has an amazing way of exposing what that is, because when you face trouble, you immediately turn to what you trust. In this case, Jesus turns in trust to the Lord. The disciples turn to something else. And it's really illustrated by this image of a sword. Multiple times in this passage, the emblem of a sword is used. And the disciples, rather than trusting in the Lord, they choose to trust the sword. Let me kind of summarize what I'm getting at with this statement, that trouble will make you trust the Lord or the sword. Trouble will make you trust the Lord or the sword. Jesus chooses to trust the Lord. The disciples, in a way, take up the sword. Now, I'll explain what I mean by the sword and how that applies to our lives in a second. But let's ask the question, what is the nature of the kind of trouble that they're facing? So Jesus tells Simon, who's Peter, he says, Satan has requested to have you that he might sift you like wheat. Now, there's another part in the Bible where a similar thing happens. It's at the beginning of the book of Job. Maybe you remember the story. Satan requests to test Job's faith in God because he says, the only reason that Job trusts you, God, is that you've given him all these incredible blessings. So I want to take those things away. And look, he'll begin to curse you. He'll abandon you. And that's similar to the nature of the trouble that Peter is going to face specifically, but also that the disciples are going to face. Their trust in God and their loyalty to Jesus, it's going to be tested. That they're going to be tempted to abandon Jesus. So Jesus ratchets up the intensity, not just for Peter, but for the disciples as a whole. He says in verse 35, when I sent you out with no money bag or knapsack or sandals, did you lack anything? And they said, nothing. This is a reference to what we have back in Luke chapter 10, where Jesus sends out 70 disciples to preach the good news of the kingdom. He says, you're going to face some resistance. However, you're going to be provided for. You are going to experience fruitfulness. People are going to respond to the word that you preach. And lo and behold, when they return and they report back to Jesus, they've had an incredibly effective and fruitful time of ministry. Jesus says to the disciples, look, here in this moment, it's going to be different. This is going to be the kind of trouble that you've never even seen in your life. Why? What's happening in this moment of trouble? Verse 37, for I tell you that this scripture must be fulfilled in me. And then he quotes from the book of Isaiah. And he was numbered with the transgressors. This is a quote from Isaiah chapter 53. This really important focal moment in the scriptures where the suffering servant, God's appointed suffering servant, his means of salvation, is going to suffer on behalf of the people. It says in the book of Isaiah that he will bear our iniquities. He will bear the iniquities, the chastisement, the just response of God to human sin will be laid upon this suffering servant. And Jesus says that hour has come. This is trouble the likes of which they've never faced and the likes of which we will never face either. Jesus tells the disciples this is a significant moment. And then he gives them an instruction. So after the Passover dinner finishes, we're told that Jesus goes with his disciples to the Mount of Olives, and he goes into a garden called the Garden of Gethsemane. And he's going to pray. But look at what he tells the disciples. He says, pray that you may not enter into temptation. Temptation to do what? To abandon him. This trouble is going to come their way, and they're going to be tempted to abandon Jesus, to trust the sword instead of the Lord. He says, look, if you're going to face this trouble and hold on to faith and trust the Lord, you are going to need to pray. Now we find out the disciples don't do that. However, that's precisely what Jesus does. And he is the example of what it looks like to face trouble and trust the Lord and not the sword. Look at what Jesus does. This is just, every time I come to this passage where Jesus prays in the garden, it moves me so deeply. It's extraordinary. Look at what he says in verse 40. In verse 42. So we're told he goes a stone's throw, he withdraws, and he goes and he prays, and he says, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Here's what's extraordinary to me about this prayer, is that here we have God the Son, the second person of the Trinity, being vulnerable and transparent with the Father, saying that he does not desire to suffer. And he asks God, he says, his exact words are, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Now, the cup is a biblical image describing suffering, but more specifically, describing the wrath of God. Jesus knows what he's about to face. He knows he's about to be numbered with the transgressors. He is about to take on that weight that the suffering servant is called to take on, the iniquity of the people. He knows he's about to suffer. And what does he say to God? If you're willing, let this pass from me. If you're willing, let there be another way. If you're willing, don't allow me to suffer. But then immediately on the heels of that, he says, nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. Jesus at no point prays that the will of the Father would not be done. And yet he's transparent, asking that God's will might be that he wouldn't have to suffer. This combination of vulnerability, tenderness, transparency, honesty, and complete submission to and trust in the will of God. This is the kind of prayer that Jesus is prescribing to face trouble and to trust in the Lord. Right here, I think we have just a really practical way to apply to your life and to my life about how to respond when we face trouble that gives us this choice between the Lord and the sword. What does it look like to face trouble and trust in the Lord? 3 simple things. Ask honestly, trust totally, and depend deeply. Ask honestly. Jesus' words give us an invitation that when we face trouble, we can go to God in honest, transparent, and vulnerable prayer. Asking God that we wouldn't suffer. Asking God to spare us the pain of this trouble. It's pretty extraordinary that Jesus invites us to communicate to and to relate to God in that kind of way. Ask honestly, but second, and this is the important counterpoint, is to trust totally. Trust totally. Jesus says, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Jesus says, I'm going to present my request to God with honesty and transparency, and at the same time, I'm going to entrust the outcome to Him entirely. Jesus knows what we need to realize, that whatever God's will is the best possible scenario, the best possible outcome. And though God's will is not always pain-free, though God's will is not always trouble-free, it is the best possible outcome. We ask honestly, trust totally, and then third, depend deeply. Look at verse 43. Right after he prays this extraordinary prayer, we're told, there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. God will never deny you the strength that you need to endure the trouble. Jesus, in this moment of agony, praying, was sent an angel from heaven, from God, to strengthen him, to move through this trouble and to trust God. God will give you and He will give me the strength we need. That when we depend on Him, to trust totally in Him, He will give us the strength we need to face whatever trouble comes along with His will. Very, very practical. Ask honestly, trust totally, and depend deeply. This is what it looks like when we face trouble, to trust in the Lord and not the sword. The disciples, however, provide a contrast. They don't do what Jesus tells them to do. He told them, pray earnestly so that you don't give in to the temptation to abandon me, to choose the sword and not trust in the Lord. What are we told here? When he arose from prayer, he came to the disciples and he found them sleeping for sorrow. This is really interesting. The gravity of the moment is not lost on the disciples. They've been told that there's a betrayer in their midst. Peter has been told that Satan is going to sift him. They've been told that this moment is far greater trouble than what they faced during any of the moments of ministry that they did with Jesus. But they're sleeping with sorrow rather than doing what Jesus instructed and praying so that they don't enter into temptation. They're sleeping for sorrow. Have you ever been through the kind of trouble that makes you just want to sleep through it? I know that I have. It makes you want to take a sleeping pill and just let time pass by, that you don't want to pay it attention because it's so difficult and so vulnerable and so tender and so tough. That's not lost on the disciples. But the way that they're responding to their trouble isn't to trust the Lord. And because they don't trust the Lord, they choose to trust in the sword. Let's make something really, really clear. When you face trouble, you are going to trust something. And if it's not God, it's going to be what I've called here the sword. So, what does this image mean? Well, in the story, the disciples think it's a literal sword. Maybe you notice this. Jesus tells them, he says, look, and let the one who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. Now that might sound at first like a contradiction. If we're supposed to trust in the Lord and not the sword, why is Jesus telling them to buy a sword? Well, New Testament scholar and commentator Leon Morris, he points out the fact that given all that Jesus says about the sword here is meant to be metaphorical. It's meant to describe the intensity of the trouble that they are going to face. Saying, look, the trouble is going to be so intense that you shouldn't even worry about a cloak, but you should rather prepare yourself for the trouble. However, the disciples take it literally, and what do they say? Lord, here are 2 swords. And he said to them, it is enough. Now, Leon Morris, again, says the language that Jesus uses here more likely doesn't mean like this is a sufficient number of swords, but rather means enough talk about these literal swords. The disciples are missing it, and we really see them miss it when we come to the next passage. So the crowd and the chief priests and the elders and this big crowd with Judas at the front of them, starts to approach Jesus. And Judas identifies Jesus by greeting him with a kiss. And here's what we're told is the reaction of the disciples. Rather than praying so that they don't enter into temptation, what did they do? Verse 49. When those who were around Jesus saw what would follow, they said, "Lord, shall we strike with the sword?" And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. Think about what the disciples have heard and their response. They have heard Jesus tell them from his own mouth, "Now is the moment when I'm going to be numbered with the transgressors. I'm going to be arrested like a thief and a robber," fulfilling Isaiah 53. The disciples should know that this arrest is coming. But what do? Instead of allowing things to take place as prophesied, as Jesus has told them, they take matters into their own hands and they're going to deal with it by taking the sword. That's what it means to trust in the sword. It's to trust in human wisdom and capability and decisions rather than to trust in what God has prescribed. Notice how some of the disciples ask him, "Should we strike with the sword?" And one of them doesn't even wait. He lashes out and he cuts off the ear of the servant of the high priest. Jesus responds and he says, "No more of this. This isn't how things are going to go." He says to the disciples in a manner, he says, "Look, you are meant to listen to what I told you this moment is about. It's about the Son of Man, the Son of God going as it was prophesied about him." But they're not paying attention to that. They're paying attention to their own best thoughts, their own best solutions, rather than what they should have been doing, which is trusting the Lord, not the sword. Then Jesus turns and addresses the crowd who has come. And he really puts his finger on the problem of trusting the sword instead of trusting the Lord. He turns and he says we're told who's there, the chief priests and the officers in the temple and the elders, and he says, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me, but this is your hour and the power of darkness." Right here we see the trusting of the sword over the Lord writ large. These leaders over the temple and the elders, we're told throughout Jesus' ministry that they act in mistrust of God's plans. They literally reject God's means of salvation. Their true high priest, their true king. You see, they're afraid that because of what Jesus has done and is doing, that the Romans are going to come and they're going to take away their place and their position of authority. They're fearful over what they're going to lose. So rather than trust God, now they take matters into their own hands and they're literally going to take swords and arrest Jesus and eventually sentence him to death. And what does Jesus say? "This is your hour and the power of darkness." There couldn't be a more sobering moment of darkness than the second person of the Trinity, God the Son, betrayed, treated like a thief and a criminal, when he was anything but. When he came into the world, healing people, preaching the good news of the kingdom and the forgiveness of sins, how is he treated? Unjustly. And he's betrayed. This moment of darkness illustrates what happens when you trust the sword instead of trusting the Lord, when you choose the best of human wisdom and power and experience rather than choosing to fundamentally and at your core trust in God. Now, these people take literal swords. What does that look like in our day and age? You see that the sword is an emblem of taking human power and human might. Here are 3 examples. There are relational swords. In your life, you will face relational trouble. And relational trouble can be some of the most anxiety-inducing and difficult to deal with because emotions run high. And there are betrayals when it comes to friendship and family members. And there can be an impulse to take matters into your own hands and to respond in the way that you think is best, rather than to seek God's wisdom and to trust God for how to navigate relational trouble. There are political swords. Literally trusting in one party or the other or in a politician to do what only Jesus can do. Should followers of Jesus be meaningfully engaged in politics? Absolutely. But should followers of Jesus believe that politicians can bring about the kingdom? No. Only Jesus can do that. But when we trust in politicians more than God, we've got things flipped around and we're trusting the sword instead of trusting the Lord. Here's another one, emotional swords. What trouble can do is that it can produce anxiety. It can produce emotions that are just really difficult to handle. The disciples are sleeping what? For sorrow. Ever been through that kind of sorrow, that kind of pain? There can be ways to deal with that are not trusting in God, turning to substances, self-medicating, distracting yourself, spending money you don't have on things that you're hoping will just ease the pain somewhat. There are emotional swords, which are ways to deal with trouble that aren't trusting God, but they're the best ideas that you can come up with. What Jesus shows us is that what lies on the other end of that is darkness, fragmentation, distortion, deterioration. The power of darkness comes from mistrusting God and choosing the sword, human wisdom, human capability, over the Lord. Let's think about how we figure out if who we're trusting in our lives. Here are a couple questions for you. How do you know when you're trusting the sword? You, personally, think about your own life. What do you do when you face trouble? Do you pray? Do you go to God with transparency, honesty, and vulnerability, asking Him and yet trusting His will? Or do you turn to distraction or self-medicating or entertainment or your own best way to deal with the solution? Those are the two options. It's the Lord or the sword. Here's another question. Do you ask Jesus and then impatiently act before you receive an answer? The disciples, some of them asked, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And then before receiving an answer, one of them lashes out and strikes the ear of the servant. There's an impulse to maybe give God a nod and say, okay, I know I should pray. God, what should I do about this situation? But if I haven't received guidance or counsel or an answer, then I'm just going to go and do my best choice. That's not trusting in the Lord. The question then is, where do we find the power to trust in God the way we see Jesus trusting in God? Think about those words. Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Where do we find the kind of power and trust to depend on God in that kind of way, to reject the best that human power has to offer and to say, God, I want your will, even if it's painful, even if it's difficult, I want your will. Where do we find the power to do that? You see, it's in Jesus Christ Himself. In fact, more specifically, it's in the agony of Jesus. Jesus persisted in prayer through such agony that we're told that He sweat drops like blood. Bible scholars point out the fact that something more is happening here than just Jesus being afraid of going to the cross. After all, Jesus has gone through His entire ministry knowing He's going to the cross, but there's something different happening here. Remember, it's His hour to be numbered with the transgressors, to be the suffering servant who takes on the iniquity of the entire world, the one who would be crushed for our transgression, for our transgressions, has begun to be crushed by God. In this moment, the Father has begun to pour out onto Jesus Christ the sin and the iniquity, the mistrust of us all. This is so important to realize, is that Jesus is bowing and praying in the garden not just as an example, but as a substitute. He would go to the cross not just as an example of obedient trust, but in our place as a substitute. The reality is that every single one of us, both you and I, have taken the sword instead of trusting the Lord. We have all turned to our own best human efforts to try and navigate life and its troubles, and have rejected the very author of life. And the reason Jesus went to the cross was not just to set an example. It was to go and take our place so that he might pay the price for our sin. When you see the agony of Christ, I believe it is in that very vision that you find the power you need to trust God, because you realize that Christ has gone in your place. Christ has paid the price for every time you have, do, and will turn to the sword instead of the Lord. And that means that you can ask God for forgiveness in the moments when we do that. And we will do that. You and I will do that. But God, by His grace, will bring us more and more into a trust in Him rather than in our own best efforts. But also in the agony of Christ, you see the trustworthiness of God. What does it say about a God who would come into the world and who would sweat drops of blood right before being arrested, going to a mock trial, and then being crucified on a cross? What does it say about whether or not He can be trusted? It is this very God who invites you to trust Him. How trustworthy is He that He would send His only Son to die for our sin? He would send His only Son in our place. He would send His only Son to pray so that He would not abandon this calling of taking our place upon the cross. He is worthy of our trust. He is worthy of our dependence. And in view of Jesus Christ, every best human sword pales by comparison, because we see how glorious, wise, and trustworthy this God is. I'm not sure where this lands for you, but here's what I know. When you see Christ experiencing agony, not just as an example, but in your place, it breaks the power of mistrust. It breaks down those walls of the parts of your life where you haven't been able to rely upon Him, and it moves us to a place where we can pray as Jesus did. Lord, not my will, but yours be done. Let me pray for you. Heavenly Father, this is a sobering moment in Jesus' life and the life of the disciples, and yet it is the very reason that we see we can trust you. Because we understand your motive. By sending your Son, Lord, you have saved us from our sin, paid the price for our sin, and have invited us to trust you rather than our own best efforts. Lord, I pray for every person listening to my voice, however this applies in their lives, give them the courage through the vision of Christ in agony in our place for us. And would you empower them by your Spirit to do whatever they need to do to trust you in their lives. It's in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, we say amen. God bless you.